So I'm really glad to welcome Andrew Sims. It would take too long to talk about all the things that Andrew Sims does, but he is part of the New Weather Institute, which he might say a little bit about. He's been very fundamental in the Green New Deal, if you know about that piece of work. He does an awful lot. He's an economist and a political activist, does an awful lot of work and writes a lot of books. So, including Tescopoly, which you may have heard of. So, big round of applause for Andrew.
Thank you very much, Bex. So my name's Andrew. I run with 7 other people a thing called the New Weather Institute. We're a think tank about rapid transition, but we do a bit of arts and culture stuff as well. Also, just for reference, I am assistant director of an outfit called Scientists for Global Responsibility. Our think tank runs a few campaigns you might have come across. The Rapid Transition Alliance, which is a network of 200 NGOs working to show examples of how we can, in a socially just way, change at the speed and scale that the climate science says is necessary. And we also run another campaign called Badvertising. I'll mention this in a moment. Badvertising is a campaign for a tobacco-style ban on adverts that promote high-carbon products and lifestyles, on the basis that promoting your own self-destruction is maybe not a good idea. And just to sort of throw in, the campaign has started to have some success, and some cities that you might have heard mentioned in other talks up until now, places like Sheffield, Leeds, Norwich, have started passing bans on high-carbon advertising. So stuff is happening. I really enjoyed listening to the previous talk about climate emergency centres from River, partly because it's almost as if the organisers today thought about how these talks would go together. Because ours fits in quite nicely, hopefully, as will become obvious. But I'm going to talk about our state of unpreparedness in the face of the inevitable surprises and threats of a heating planet. And there is a pamphlet. I brought a few paper copies along, which people are welcome to take. You can also download it off the newweather.org website called Unprepared. Unprepared. How unprepared are we? Well, to use a cultural reference, which is maybe not the most obvious thing at Green Gathering, let me walk you mentally across the Channel to France and up to Paris, where there's a little sporting event going on at the moment. Happens every 4 years. This one cost about 9 billion euros. Years in the planning. The most sophisticated planners, event planners, brought to focus on a global showcase watched by billions of people worldwide, on which France's international reputation depends. They thought of everything apart from the weather. I don't know if any of you saw the opening ceremony. For me, the defining moment was this guy, one of the best classical pianists in the world, outside on a platform with a grand piano, and you're just watching this deluge, thinking, that piano probably cost thousands of pounds. It can't be good for it. And the misery on his face was quite extraordinary. So it literally rained on their parade, but it didn't stop there. Because one of the most wealthy and sophisticated nations in the world that had had years to plan this and spent billions on it was also hoping to make a big show of how much they had cleaned up the River Seine. And to demonstrate that, before the Games, they got some of France's top politicians to take a dip in the river. But again, they hadn't thought about what happens when you get a lot of rain. It washes, quite literally, loads of shit off the land into the water. And what was one of the first high-profile events that they were going to showcase to the world, the triathlon. And where were the swimmers going to swim? They were going to swim in the River Seine, so it got cancelled. So my point is that at the moment, even where you have an event taking place, which people have known for years would be the focus of attention of the entire world with an internet connection, who's got a vague interest in sport, they still screwed up. They were, for that particular eventuality, unprepared. Unprepared. So, and when it comes to sport, actually, as a way of having a conversation about this issue, which I think we all really care about, just last autumn, one of the world's top tennis players, a guy called Daniil Medvedev, in the heat and humidity of the US Open, said a player is going to die in these kind of conditions. A couple of years ago, Joe Root, one of the top England cricketers, was hospitalised after having to play in 40-degree temperatures in Australia. Events are getting cancelled. Events are getting rearranged. People are suffering. And interestingly, going back to the point I made about the advertising campaign at the start, the former Australian Rugby Football Union captain, David Pocock, has come out and said that we should stop the major polluters like the airlines, the car makers, and the fossil fuel companies from sponsoring sport, because sport gives you the biggest audience in the world. It is incredibly powerful in setting social and cultural norms. And if you think back to a few years ago, the other people who sponsored sport were tobacco, big tobacco. And the same playbook is used by big fossil fuels as was used by big tobacco. So these kind of things come together. It is a form of unpreparedness. And the extreme weather which Paris has been experiencing reflects the fact that the average temperatures in the city now are over 3 degrees hotter than they were the last time Paris staged the Olympics in 1924. And the extreme events that they've been experiencing are 4 times more likely to have happened because of the degree to which the planet has already heated. And Paris is a city much like London, a lot of hard landscaping, a lot of hard infrastructure, which gives you hotspots. You know, you think back to just a few years ago in 2021, London was hit by flash floods that caused massive damage to homes and businesses. In 2022, there was a heat wave with record temperatures hitting 40 degrees. And last year, 2023, was the hottest year globally and the second hottest in the UK. And earlier this year, there was a report from the London Climate Resilience Review, which was commissioned by the Mayor of London. And they looked at London and the UK more broadly, and they came to the conclusion that we are underprepared for the current, note NB, not the future, not what we know is going to happen anyway, just the current frequency and severity of climate impacts. And they identified lethal risks to Londoners with certain communities, you can probably guess, low-income households, the elderly, minority groups, children, vulnerable health groups, being the most susceptible. They said we needed a step change in adaptation planning and investment. You know, so much for revealing a continuing sort of general level of unpreparedness now in 2024. But 32 years ago, I can see there's a few people in the audience who might remember the Earth Summit held in Rio in 1992. Not casting any aspersions, I just think, like me, you can probably remember it. Maybe some of you were there. But 32 years ago, we identified the fact that we needed local action. And they came up with a list of plans called Local Agenda 21s, much forgotten now. But they called on the need for greater coordination to deal with adaptation and mitigation all the time back then. But nothing happened. And what of current plans? What about the plans that we have now that we've had time to learn from our many mistakes? And with the science so much clearer, surely we've got our shit together now. Well, earlier this year in March, there's an outfit called the Climate Change Committee, which is kind of like an independent advisor to government on climate policy. And they looked at the government's National Adaptation Plan, which has the rather fabulous acronym of NAP3. NAP3, which was published last summer, about a year ago. And it reviewed progress on the previous plan. And they commented that since the Climate Change Act was passed in 2008, which mandated that we should have adaptation plans. And I quote, they concluded, "The country is still strikingly unprepared." The new plan was meant to show how people, buildings and vital infrastructure, things like our telecoms, water, transport, energy, etc., could be protected from the multiple impacts of heating, heat waves, droughts, flooding, extreme weather events. The Climate Change Committee concluded, NAP 3 lacks the pace and ambition needed to address the risk. It fails to set out a compelling vision. The lack of a measurable vision will prevent effective delivery of adaptation by public agencies, local authorities, and the private sector. It doesn't finish there. There's a few more problems with the plan. There are issues of governance, investment, and monitoring, which are currently fundamentally limiting. They said that NAP 3 must be strengthened to avoid locking in additional climate impacts. They said that our national adaptation policy must be reorganised so that it becomes a fundamental aspect of policy making across all departments. And so, if you'll forgive me the obvious and unavoidable pun, where NAP 3 was concerned, our government has been asleep on the job. Why does it matter? It matters because if you look at the research into heat thresholds, what happens at different temperatures as higher degrees normalize and become more common. So even just at 20 degrees, Legionella bacteria start developing in normal drinking water. At 24 degrees, the London Underground start to work to prevent track buckling. Less than a degree more, 24.7 degrees, for a 2-day duration, and deaths and hospital admissions rise. Back in 2003, there was a heat wave in London, and there was an estimated 600 more people than usual died because of heat-related causes. Even well-insulated houses overheat when it gets to 27 degrees. Power cables start getting hit at around 30, and the likelihood of power outages goes up. At 33 degrees, road surfaces begin to soften and melt. Now, if you lose power in a disaster, and you live in a world in which we become overwhelmingly dependent, for example, on smartphones for access, not just to each other, but to our ability to pay for things, to emergency services, God knows what other apps you might have on your phone. I used to say, in relation to how the vulnerability of our food supply chains was revealed by the road hauliers strike back around the turn of the millennium, that at any one point in time, a sort of 9 meals from anarchy, that's the amount of stocks that the supermarkets might hold in the shops. But now perhaps it's just a single phone charge away, something separating us from various forms of chaos. So what do we do? What should we do about it? Now, to discuss that, I wanted to kind of nip briefly back to 1953, when on the night of Saturday, the 31st of January, coastal communities in eastern England experienced an unprecedented tidal surge, 18 feet above sea level. It was accompanied by hurricane-force winds, 126 miles per hour, as they hit Orkney heading south. Now, when the storm surge was squeezed into the Dover Strait and Channel, sea defences were overwhelmed. Over 300 people were killed in around Lincolnshire, Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. More were killed in Scotland. 1,800 lost their lives in the Netherlands. The scale of the disaster was bigger than that. There were 32,000 evacuated, 40,000 homeless, 160,000 acres of land inundated with seawater, which was then, the land was then unusable for years afterwards because of salt inundation. Power stations, gasworks, roads, railways, sewage services, water services, all put out of action. But the first anybody knew about this, about the fact that something was going to happen, was when the 7:27 p.m. train from Hunstanton to King's Lynn ran into a wall of water and was literally hit by a bungalow floating on the crest of a wave. They were unprepared. But in terms of what we need to do about it, an interesting dynamic emerged back then. There's a great essayist called Ken Walpole who, drawing on the local county historians, do amazing work in the archives. He wrote up an account of this, which showed that the extraordinary way that so many individuals and local organisations swung into action in the middle of the night to rescue neighbours and near neighbours. It was pointed out that almost every East Anglian appeared to belong to an organisation whose loyalties and resources could be called upon in an instant without demur. Now, things are really different now, but one overriding characteristic of that awful night in 1953 can be seen still today in disasters ranging from the Grenfell Tower atrocity to the pandemic and the impacts of worsening weather extremes in a warming world. And that is that in the failure of officially guided measures for pre-disaster preparedness, disaster response, and post-disaster recovery, it is the communities affected themselves who are typically the first responders and the foundation for recovery. But, and this is what we seek to change, invariably, these are the communities who have not been resourced, equipped, or given sufficient agency and control to best perform that role. I'm not going to go into a load of detail, but the circumstance that we have at the moment, the way that our national civil contingencies planning operates, which is a very top-down procedure, divided up into sort of police district areas, which are often very large, and which deal mostly with just the major emergency response teams, based upon forums at the local level, which almost never meet and never have their websites updated. It's a different patch, sort of picture around the country, but generally it's a system gathering dust which is top down and disconnected from what needs to happen at the local level in order to build the relationships, which means that communities are prepared in advance, have the resources, and as we were hearing earlier with about the climate emergency centres, the spaces where people can gather, the information and the communication networks which are vital at those times, and the resources stored to get you through the most difficult patch. The system that we have at the moment is dysfunctional, gathering dust, and not working. But what we see in instances like when the community does respond, when it seemed that the authorities were helpless, for example, in response to the Grenfell fire incident, you see again what we saw back in the 50s, the astonishing vivacity and generosity of the community, both local and national, that incapacity of the local authority and central government to respond quickly and adequately, and the unexpected nature of the disaster, if only to officialdom. Because as is happening now with the climate emergency, and as happened with Grenfell, people were warning national bodies consistently for years that things were going to fall apart. So without going into the detail, we have this system for national response, civil contingencies, which was actually triggered by three things which happened around the time of the turn of the millennium, which spurred the Labour government to do a revision of the civil contingency system. And that was when there was flooding, there was the foot and mouth outbreak, and there were fuel protests. So they passed the Civil Contingencies Act. So we have, for what it's worth, three levels of emergency defined: significant, serious, and catastrophic. That's the limited good news, that we actually have a national structure based on those local resilience forums. But when this was reviewed again in 2022, a similar list to the shortfallings that I mentioned earlier about our preparedness and resilience applies to that system too. Challenges at the level of engagement, the role of the chair about how these things run, how resilience activities are coordinated, accountability, assurance, and the level of investment in local resilience, all failing. So we have the system. It's nicknamed COBRA. You've probably heard of it. The actual official phrase is COBRA. That's the Cabinet Office response. but it's known as Cobra. And we think that there should be something different, that there should be something grassroots, something that is grown up through the agency, the resources, and the relationships which bind communities together. And the people who we know from experience, whether from this country or from decades of experience of dealing with disasters in the humanitarian relief world, that it is communities who are the first responders. That we need a truly civil contingencies. And we thought, well, they call the official one Cobra. We thought we should call the community one something nice like Mongoose, you know? Animals that kind of work together to make things happen. And what would our sort of mongoose response look like? Well, it would work out what needs to be put in place before disasters strike. You know, what are the meeting places that we've heard about where people can gather? Where can people get information if their phones are no longer working? Where is the food stored? Where can you get potable water? That it would identify and resolve conflicts or barriers to action within civil society, anticipate and prepare for what future tensions there might be by rehearsing them in discussions in those community spaces. We provide an environment to facilitate adaptive, anticipatory learning through deliberation. Importantly, it would allow civil society to then assume a more active role in shaping events and outcomes, and it would require good governance. It would be central to how these local forums, these local civil contingencies forums would operate. Because we've got huge experience accumulated through citizens' juries, experiments in sortition, deliberative decision-making to learn from. Experience at the international level, the local level, has shown that if you just leave it to the large, already well-established and powerful groups, they will have an overweening influence over how things are shaped. So we need to make sure that how it works at the local level genuinely binds people in. And I'm getting the full 5 fingers from Bex at the back, but I'm going to surprise her because I'm going to finish in one. So I'll start with sport. So I thought I'd kind of round off with a kind of reference from sport. Sport is full of like cheesy, motivational sayings and sort of like car bumper sticker philosophy. So I thought I'd finish with one which I hear said so many times by the coaches at my local running club, Herne Hill Harriers in South London. And that is, why does this matter? Why do we need to act? We need to act because, and we're going to find out how to act in a moment, because, ladies and gentlemen, if we fail to prepare, we should be prepared to fail.